Hello. Hello, welcome to everyone who is joining us today for this webinar, Institutionalizing Monitoring Evaluation at the Subnational Level, Views from Brazil and Africa. Before we begin, I'd like to mention there's simultaneous translation to Portuguese. Então, tem tradução simultânea do inglês para o português, português to English, English to português. Então, por favor, se você quer tradução simultânea, você seleciona o canal no Zoom, clica no botão interpretação, entre parênteses, Globo. Então, deem uma olhadinha aí que tem interpretação para quem quiser acompanhar o webinar em português. So I was saying just in Portuguese, there is interpretation. So if you want to switch from one language to another, just click in the Zoom, the channel in the Zoom, in the button interpretation, and then you can switch to our different languages. Before we begin, I just want to read very briefly a disclaimer from FGV. These statements expressed by members of Fundação Getulio Vargas staff and by guests who participate in events and online broadcasts represents exclusively the opinions of the authors and not necessarily the institutional position of FGV. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event spontaneously, and with this, they authorize the use of their name, voice, and image, in addition to assigning the copyrights relating to exposure of this broadcast, which will be available later in channels of FGV official channels. To continue this transmission, we ask you to express your agreement by verbalizing or signing your agreement. So everyone seems to be in agreement. So this is very exciting news for me. First, I want to introduce myself. My name is Lycia Lima. I work in CLEAR for Lusophone Africa in Brazil. I'm the deputy director of the center. I've been here for over 10 years, and I've witnesses this Evaluation Week initiative grow into what's today one of the biggest knowledge sharing events in monitoring evaluation globally. So we're actually very proud of having launched GLOCO together with CLEAR and Global Evaluation Initiative. GLOCO had another name before, but then it became GLOCO since 2019, and it has hosted thousands of events in many different languages across 6 continents. In this year, we have 350 events throughout this week. Today is day 2, covering a variety of monitoring evaluation topics in many different languages. So please have a look on the program. There's very interesting stuff. Many of them have translation, so there's a lot of stuff not to be missed. Here in Brazil, in Portuguese-speaking Africa, where we also operate, we have 50 events that are being organized in Portuguese. So this has been growing over the years, so it's very exciting. So now straight to the roundtable. So this event we're organizing here today, the idea is to provide a comparative discussion between Brazil and Africa on the institutionalization of evaluation at the subnational level. CLEAR Lab, I don't know if you all know, but Lab stands for Lusophone Africa in Brazil. We work obviously a lot in Brazil since we're based at FGV in Brazil, but we also have a vast work program in African countries that speak Portuguese. So this is always an opportunity to bring together our other CLEAR Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa colleagues to try to do an approach that is aligned to the work they're doing in Lusophone Africa and Anglophone and Francophone Africa. So today we have the honor to receive the following guests. So first I'd like to welcome Dirk Hoffmann, who is an evaluator with the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEval. He is part of Evaluation Capacity Development team, and he works in Latin America and Anglophone Africa. So Dirk's expertise encompasses climate change and SDGs, protected area management, and international climate policy. I'd like to welcome as well Ayabulela Dlakavu, is the manager of Twende Mbele program, as well as a researcher and analyst of public policy, foreign policy, international organization, global and regional peace and security, political economy, monitoring evaluation practitioner, academic with an extensive background in international development, sociology, and history. Twende Mbele is a peer learning partnership of African governments and regional organizations interested to use monitoring evaluation to strengthen government performance and accountability. And last but not least, obviously, I'd like to welcome Lorena Figueiredo, who is one of our star researchers here at CLEAR Lab. Lorena has a background in law. She graduated in law from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, holding a master's degree in urban policy from the Paris Institute of Political Sciences. And Lorena is also currently on her way to finish her PhD in law at the University of São Paulo. So I would like to pass the word to Dirk, and thank you all for being here, and I'll see you later.
Thank you, Lycia, for this wonderful introduction. Actually, I'm really happy and proud to be here with two speakers, researchers, speakers, part of the evaluation capacity development scene in their respective countries on an international level. And this is something that is always for me very special with G-local or glocal, whatever you prefer, bringing the local together at a global level. And I don't like this discussion, what is more important. We need both. We need local. We need local research, we need local activities, but we also need places and moments to connect. And this event is really one of those where we're trying to connect research that has been done in Brazil, research that has been done in Africa, and me coming on from a German Institute for Development Evaluation that works with both of those regions, trying to bridge, trying to bring together, and trying to enter into dialogue. And this will be in a dialogue between the two researchers or panelists, and this will be in the second half of the program, also dialogue with you as the audience. So I'm extremely happy to be here. The webinar, Institutionalizing Monitoring Evaluation at the Subnational Level. We've all seen, and there's been quite some attention to monitoring and evaluation systems being installed in different parts of the world, limiting us to Africa and Latin America, maybe. We've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, a number of countries have put in place evaluation systems. Some are still working on bringing together monitoring and evaluation, having a full-fledged monitoring evaluation system, having a working system. And that's where institutionalization comes in. It's not only creating an institution. Institutionalization is more than that, and we'll hear about this from our two panelists. But what about the subnational level? In some of the places in the world, we have Brazil. Brazil is a huge country, and some of the states in Brazil, they're bigger than countries. They're bigger than some of the smaller countries. So subnational can mean different things in different places. If we take a smaller country, let's say Costa Rica, one of our partner countries, you talk about subnational level and you're very easily going to the municipal level. So subnational is very diverse in different countries and different settings. What is also interesting, and that's probably something for the discussion later on as well, is when we talk about governance systems. And we all know that monitoring and evaluation is placed within governance structures. And the history of the different regions of the world, the different countries are different. We know about the impacts of colonialism on the political administrative structures. So there's a Portuguese tradition that is still visible in Brazil, in the Francophone and Anglophone African countries, respectively. You can still see the influence of French colonial structures or of British colonial structures. So there's a lot of variety that we can look at, and some of it we will look at with our two presentations. One on institutionalization in taking 6 African countries, and one looking at Brazil. So this should make for a lot of a lot of discussion. And actually, you probably know there's very little research on those levels. It's not only that subnational evaluation and monitoring systems are not much in place, but we don't know much about those that exist. Why do they exist? What are their challenges? What have they achieved so far? How do they connect to the national level? So those are some of the questions we're going to address in the next 45 minutes, roughly. We have two presentations, 20-25 minutes each. After that, we will have a first round of questions to the panelists from my side, very brief. And after that, we'll open the floor to the wider audience so that you can make your comments, ask the researchers, and hopefully have a lively discussion from taking into account the different angles and perspectives that we're having here. So with this, enough from me as a moderator from the moment. I'll pass over to Ayabulela Dlakavu, the program director of Twende Mbele, and he will start with the first presentation on the African countries. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Program Director, Mr. Dirk Hoffmann. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues from whichever geopolitical space you are joining from. It's certainly a pleasure for us as Twende Mbele to be invited to share learning spaces, sharing spaces with CLEAR, Lusophone Africa and Brazil, to share learning spaces with the German Institute for Development Evaluation. So we don't take this lightly. Chair, I just need to move this to, I hope it's not interfering with the screen. Please do confirm. The participants, I think they're showing on my screen, but I guess there's no problem.
You might want to put it in presentation mode. Excuse me.
Oh, okay. Let me go for that then.
Yes, excellent.
That's fine. Okay. Now, colleagues, I think let me just outline what I'll be doing in the next, hopefully 15 to 20 minutes so that I don't put people to sleep. But I think we're just going to highlight 4 things. And all of this is essentially based on what Twende Mbele tried to do in terms of, I think, what the session chair was saying, to say that there are many M&E systems that exist, and ours essentially is to go and unearth them, find and assess what these M&E systems are doing vis-a-vis public policy development, public policy implementation. And essentially, I think most of us in this evaluation capacity development space, we do the work we do so that the countries we work with essentially sort of produce desirable development outcomes and hopefully impact so that our people experience real social change meaning that everyone has food to eat 3 times a day, has a shelter, basically all the human rights that we all aspire to. And M&E, I think it finds its value when it is able to sort of drive governments to sort of achieve those public policy goals that are articulated by countries. So Twende Mbele in 2022 started an ambitious project essentially to go and understand the extent to which monitoring evidence feeds into a country's development planning processes, and at the same time, the extent to which monitoring and evaluation data or evidence feeds into a country's budget development or resource allocation. And because Twende Mbele has 6 countries, South Africa in Southern Africa, Uganda, and Kenya in East Africa, we've got 2 countries in West Africa, Francophone Africa, that is being Benin and Niger. And then we have Ghana as the sole English-speaking or Anglophone country in West Africa. So this study was essentially rolled out in those countries with the exception of Niger for various reasons that I won't go into now. So we wanted to understand, and fortunately for us, some of these countries are quite not necessarily as federated as Brazil in terms of the political system, but they do have a certain level of government devolution, meaning that there's quite a semi-federated kind of governance going on where the central government does sort of share some governance powers, or devolve some of the governance powers to, let's say, municipalities, to provinces or regional administrations. I think in Brazil they call them states. So we wanted to get a picture of where M&E evidence is going, because one of the issues we have in the African continent, let me be specific, sub-Saharan Africa, is that we find that there's a lot of monitoring evidence around, there's a lot of evaluations around, but we wanted to understand what is the use of all this literature and all this evidence. Is it feeding into critical governance processes of planning? Is it feeding into critical processes of resource allocation? And so that's why we entered into this. So my presentation will sort of, I won't go in depth into what those studies found, but I'll narrow it down to 4 things. The first one is to sort of conceptualize what we mean by monitoring and evaluation institutionalization. And the second one, we will go into, I think, firstly, let me say we're going to sort of conceptualize institutionalization as a concept. What do we mean in the broader sense? And then we'll narrow it down to M&E institutionalization, which is probably of interest to the colleagues on the call. And then, of course, we'll go into the findings from the studies I mentioned. And in the interest of time, I decided let's go with Benin in West Africa, and we'll go with South Africa in Anglophone, Southern Africa. And then I'll try and sort of tie up some of the key lessons we've learned from both case studies, essentially. Now, yeah. So I'm going to fiddle around with this as we go along. But yeah, I'll try and keep it at the bottom. So what do we mean by institutionalization? So I think from this slide, colleagues, I'll just be brief. 2 points. The first one, from ourselves as Twende Mbele, when we conceptualized institutionalization, we were basically saying that institutionalization is essentially when a government or any other institution internalizes norms, frameworks that they set up. For instance, if a government establishes an M&E policy, it is passed by cabinet and becomes an official government policy. What we mean by institutionalization is essentially that all the government entities essentially do all the prescripts of that particular framework, essentially meaning that that policy is not just gathering dust, or it does not just exist for the sake of existing, but institutions actually use some of the prescripts outlined in that particular policy. So that's what we mean by institutionalization. And I think yesterday when I was speaking with the task team, or the team presenting here, I made the example of every country has laws, and the extent to which those laws are abided by determines whether a country has effectively institutionalized laws and norms in a particular country. So simply meaning, if you've got probably the highest crime rates and so on, or very high crime rates, I think what that means in the legal sense is that there's not a lot of internalization, or there's no significant internalization of laws. Now, let me bring it down to M&E institutionalization. What we mean by that is essentially when you have a public sector, and by public sector, we mean all public institutions or government institutions, that essentially do the following. Number one, they commission evaluations, or they undertake regular monitoring. Number two, those reports are used somewhere, be it to formulate, in the case of monitoring, be it to sort of track the degree to which government interventions are being implemented as planned, and so on. And then if there is need, you do course correction to ensure that government policies, programs, or projects are essentially implemented as planned. Then in terms of evaluations, we are saying that if there is M&E institutionalization, and of course there will be a whole continuum here, it means that government is commissioning evaluations, number one. Number two, those evaluations are completed, and that's another topic altogether. Once they are completed, those evaluations are used somewhere. In this case of our study, we wanted to check evaluations that are used to formulate medium-term development plans or annual development plans, depending on which, but essentially we focused on annual and medium-term development plans. And in sub-Saharan Africa, those medium-term development plans are usually over a 5-year period. And then we go into budgeting, which is more annual. I think this is essentially a global standard where a budget allocation in a government is done over a 12-month period. So that is what we mean by M&E institutionalization. So that's by way of me giving a conceptual framework. So I think I've gone through what the problem statement was. So that research problem for us is this lack of use of M&E evidence in planning as well as in budgeting. Because what we have found in those studies and even in general observation, because while Twende Mbele did this study in M&E in planning and budgeting, there are many diagnostic reports that have been written about Africa's state of M&E capacities, as well as enabling environments and the uptake of M&E evidence. I'll probably mention, which Madam Lycia had mentioned at the beginning, the Global Evaluation Initiative, the CLEAR centers, CLEAR Anglophone Africa, CLEAR Francophone Africa. They've done a lot of great and insightful diagnostic reports on the state of M&E systems across Africa. But what we have found, even in those preliminary or earlier studies, is that there's a lot of M&E evidence lying around, but it's not systematic because it's not being taken up anywhere in the governance processes or the public policy cycle, if we were to take that. So that is the problem we wanted to solve, to say, here we have M&E evidence production, but where is it being used? Why is it not being used? And so on. And the reason why we undertook this study and why it is an important research problem for us is because if M&E information is just produced for the sake of compliance, then M&E practice and probably after practice discourse will sort of die a natural death in sub-Saharan Africa, because the intrinsic value of doing monitoring and evaluation is that it gets used somewhere in the governance cycle. So that's why we are saying that this problem was particularly important for us, so that M&E transcends or sort of graduates from being a discourse or a conference topic, but actually becomes a management tool that is used by government to manage performance and to ensure that M&E is sort of an instrument to drive better policy performance and to drive social change and economic development on the continent. So those are the preliminaries out of the way. I have mentioned the countries where these studies were undertaken. I just decided to be an artist so that I can show some of the flags of some of the countries we work with. In terms of methodology, again, here I will be very brief, colleagues. So in most of these case studies, we decided to adopt a standardized methodology. The first one was to review literature on the topics at hand. Literature simply meaning that general literature as well as gray literature of governments. And because if you look at how these studies are set up, we are studying three things. We are studying monitoring and evaluation as two functions, interrelated functions or interdependent functions. We are studying planning systems in government, and these are quite varied. I mentioned how planning typically is undertaken in sub-Saharan Africa. You'll have your medium-term development plan set up, which is then operationalized through annual plans. Then you'll have our third area of study was budgeting. In this case, we looked at annual budgeting, but in other cases, we sort of looked at the medium-term expenditure framework of a government, which is usually on a 3-year rolling cycle. And again, they were also seeking to see what is the basis of those budgets being formulated. Is it budgets that are formulated based on, let's say, a governing party sort of ideology as well as political projects? Or when you are setting up a budget, you look at past performance. And if we're looking at past performance, are we looking at expenditure reviews, or are we looking at annual reports that have said, okay, we said we're going to roll out a youth development program over a 12-month cycle. These were the reports we got over quarterly basis, 4 quarters. And on the basis of that, we have seen that, oh, maybe that particular program needs to be funded a bit more. Maybe the resource allocation in the first year was very poor. And this is how we're sort of funding it for the next 12-year cycle. So that is how we sort of went about it. So it was gray literature, general literature, and then we distributed mass surveys to as many public institutions as possible, because some entities, depending on the side, or some countries, depending on the size of government, you'll probably find that you can find that there are 40 ministries. So that survey sought to serve the purpose of being able to generate a lot of data, but requiring less human labor. And then the surveys were sort of supplemented by key informant interviews based on essentially identifying particular ministries or sampled ministries who would then respond to that key informant interview guide to supplement those other two data sources. So as colleagues will see, there was quite a lot of triangulation in the methodology we went for. So in some countries, in Benin, we also looked at, I think there were 6 communes. So Benin calls them communes, but probably in other contexts, it might be local government or municipalities. In South Africa, it was more a national study. And there was a reason behind that, because South Africa's pre-2019 or before 2019, South Africa's national evaluation policy did not cover municipalities. And it was only after the review of that policy that they discovered that, hey, we need to find a way for this policy to also permeate and be inclusive of those subnational spheres of government, because they actually have a core service delivery function. So that's why we went for this 3-pronged methodology. And I'm actually stressing this, colleagues, because if I don't go through methodology, you always find that maybe the findings of your research can be quite contested. I'm not going to spend much on the conceptual framework, because it was just based on the studies and how they sort of established the key concepts that were going to be the subject of inquiry. So I'll just breeze through this particular area. So let me go through the findings from Benin, which is a country that is, so it's more like a central or unitary type of state in terms of political system. So central government essentially has probably most of the governance powers, but there is devolution of governance powers to what they call departments, which is probably regional governments in Brazil, equivalent to probably the states, and then communes. I think Benin has over 70 communes. So we had to find a balance between balancing the national study as well as sort of finding a representative sample for the communes led by the government itself. And so, yeah, following the same methodology. So I think one of the key findings from Benin is that they seek to intervene and ensure a use of evaluation findings through evaluation dissemination workshops, where the entities that are in charge of sort of implementing a particular program will be invited. They'll take part in sort of data collection and so on, but they'll also be there in the dissemination after validation, so that there is ownership of those results. The same happens at the commune level, where communes will be convened, and sort of the dissemination of evaluation results are sort of also inclusive of communal development plans or stakeholders who are in charge of, because everything happens within a vacuum. So for instance, in communes, the center of governance there is essentially the communal development plans. And that communal development plan essentially is the articulation of the development aspirations of that particular commune. So most evaluations are undertaken on communal development plans. So when you're disseminating evaluation results at communes, you make sure that the staff who are in charge of design, implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation of those community development plans are there in a dissemination workshop. And that's sort of, I think Benin has found that it actually strengthens the ownership of those results and probable usage of them. I think some of the key challenges, I'm going to be fiddling again with this. Some of the key, okay. I think I've gone past, well, okay, I've gone way past where I was supposed to be. Sorry about that, colleagues. So one of the keys, so we identified some key obstacles to use of evaluation results in Benin, speaking to this whole M&E institutionalization framework we've adopted. And some of the key obstacles is that evaluation reports are too long, or language is too technical. And I think this is a common challenge that we found across the countries, but I'll keep it to both Benin and South Africa. But this was a common challenge we found across, because most senior managers who make decisions on policies or policy formulators, who are usually politicians, are not necessarily M&E jargonistic people. They're not from the M&E field. So when we craft evaluation recommendations, I think we need to take care of the language we use. So we need to write reports at a level where the language needs to be massaged in terms of the jargon we used in evaluation. The second key, and most of these recommendations come from even policymakers themselves who were interviewed. The issue of poorly written recommendations was another one that ensures that most of those evaluation reports do not graduate from being complete reports and get taken up into decision-making structures. So most policymakers feel like they are poorly written. Lack of willingness to implement recommendations by intervention teams. I think we could go at length about what that means, but essentially programs are not immune to politics. I guess because there are some policies that are necessitated by the socio-economic dynamics, but there are certain policies or projects that are political in nature. And so that's why you've got lack of willingness at times to take up those results. Insufficient dissemination of results, where an evaluation is completed but doesn't get disseminated enough. Maybe for the program team that was evaluating, they feel like they've met the output and therefore there's no need so those results essentially only live with those people who are involved in the evaluation. And probably the biggest cause, again, is probably lack of funding for evaluations. So in the African continent, I think it is donors who tend to probably provide most of the financing for evaluations. For governments, I don't think that internationally agreed standard of saying we'll put up a budget of 10% of the overall program budget for an evaluation. So it hasn't really been internalized this side of the world. So it's still somewhat a normative kind of goal, but it hasn't really materialized yet. So there is lack of funding for evaluations unless a government finds a development partner who's willing to finance an evaluation. Yeah, Chair, I think you will stop me, but I think we can go through. I'll skip the recommendations because they're based on the challenges initially, but I think some of the key recommendations we made in Benin. Number one was at the time we wrote these reports, Benin was going through a process of passing an M&E law, a law to make it mandatory for public policies to be evaluated. And I think I'm happy to share that recommendation, we are not attributing the study, but I think that recommendation falls away because Benin in January 2024 passed a public policy evaluation law, which is good news for the national evaluation system there. Need to translate evaluation recommendations into operational action plans. And this speaks to the issue of language. I think we mentioned earlier on that the language in the evaluation reports you find sometimes is too technical. And I think making it actionable lies in the language we use. Allocating a set percentage for intervention budget for evaluation, I think that's an international norm. Building evaluation capacity of senior managers. And I think this is one thing Twende Mbele has been trying to impression on partner governments to say, when we're having an evaluation capacity building workshop, don't just bring people in M&E. Bring senior managers to a capacity building workshop so that they get the appreciation for evaluation and why we do evaluations. Otherwise, it will remain a foreign topic to them. Not just senior managers, but because we're working in the budgeting and planning space, we've started making quotas to say if we have 10 people coming to a workshop, at least 2 must come from planning and 1 must be a finance official who is involved in budget, so that that person, by the time they reach adequate evaluation capacity, they are able to sort of motivate for the seeking of evaluative evidence. Raising awareness, advocacy, those are standard recommendations. South Africa, again, let me just give the public administration overview. South Africa is a semi-federated kind of state. It's unitary constitutionally, but there is quite a level of devolution to the 9 provinces. And then there's also metropolitan municipalities, which contribute quite a sizable chunk to the country's GDP. And so they've got some level of power in terms of governance and so on. In terms of M&E infrastructure, another thing about South Africa and Benin is that they are considered generally in the literature to be first-generation national evaluation systems on the continent. So they are regarded as those countries who should have maturing or reaching matured status in terms of national evaluation systems. And you sort of see it in the frameworks they have. South Africa has probably 3 policy frameworks on M&E. There's that government-wide M&E system framework from 2007. There's a national evaluation policy framework of 2011, revised in 2019, and currently now we are working with the South African Department for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation to also review that 2019 amended policy. So it goes to show that these policies are not necessarily left to be permanent kind of frameworks, but they are reviewed every 5 years to check whether M&E is sort of festering through into the culture of public administration as well. Yeah, one of the things we found in South Africa, I think, let me not spend too much time because I think I ate most of my time.
Two more minutes, please, if you could.
Yeah, 2 more minutes, yeah. Yeah, so for South Africa, I think the main issue, colleagues, was that M&E information does get used in South Africa, but the main problem we found was a structural problem where South Africa has sort of fragmented these functions. So M&E is across public institutions, you'll find that there's an M&E office, there's a planning office, and then there's a budgeting office. So those three systems, M&E systems, planning systems, budgeting systems, they are usually quite fragmented, which presents a challenge for the use of M&E, because it means that if people are not aware or are not necessarily champions or appreciative of M&E evidence, it's very easy to marginalize M&E evidence. So that was the main problem in South Africa. But I think one of the key interventions that have helped South Africa to sort of build, I think, quite a sufficient base for M&E evidence use is the fact that M&E conferences have become the norm. The South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association is able to attract senior managers across government, which makes the language of M&E as well as the lingua franca and so on not a foreign object. So I think that's what has sort of assisted South Africa to, in the context of having those fragmented systems, but to still find a sufficient level of M&E usage in governance, because you've got M&E champions that are exposed to M&E and who go to conferences. And I think the capacity building kind of interventions in SA are quite strong. At the municipal level, local government level, you actually have now a monitoring, evaluation, and planning network for metropolitan municipalities. Those are big municipalities with big budgets who actually discharge most of the development functions in South Africa, like basic service delivery, road networks, delivering water, and so on. So those metro learning networks are able to spread the gospel of M&E. So now you have sort of M&E being a message even at local government level. So there's that level of appreciation building up at local government in South Africa, which sort of helps also to bring that evaluative culture and that M&E institutionalization. But of course, at subnational level in South Africa, just like in Benin, it has been overtaken by the national government. Well, not overtaken, because national government has received quite a lot of attention in terms of M&E capacity building. But at local government level, it's only now that the discourse is coming through that let's not leave subnational government behind. And I think it's quite a universal challenge. Actually, I think, Dirk, you gave me 2 minutes, but I think the main lessons from the 2 case studies is that at national level, these are first generation M&E systems. In the 2000s, they had already started building up M&E infrastructure. And in the 2020s, I think they've built up sufficient capacity at national level. Probably not so much across the other sectors in terms of bridging into other sectors, but the national office responsible for M&E coordination is strong. It has the frameworks and so on. I think the key issue now is to send the message, which is an issue of, I think, stakeholder management and intergovernmental relations, to now get the other institutions to also buy into this message of M&E and evaluation as being a transformative kind of tool. Subnational level, the picture is not very advanced as the national one, but I think the most important thing, and which often triggers systemic change, is that conversations are starting, and you've got champions, institutional champions like that monitoring and evaluation network, which is sort of like a community of practice established by the municipalities themselves, independent of national government. So you've got that mushrooming of M&E even at the local government level now. So I think in future, colleagues, you will have what we want to see in African governance architecture of a top-down and bottom-up M&E system, which helps also with M&E institutionalization. So I think, Chair, having eaten into time, Madam Lorena might kill me, so let me stop now.
No, thank you very much. We're still within our time limit, so yeah, barely though, but that's pretty much okay. Thank you very much, Ayabulela, for this exciting presentation. I'm here and I would like to listen to the examples of the other countries as well. We know we don't have time to do that, but this is really exciting research. No further comments at this point, but I'll hand over directly to Lorena Figueiredo from CLEAR Lab to let us know what is happening in Brazil. The floor is yours, Lorena. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Let me just put it on. Okay. Thank you, Dirk, and thank you, Ayabulela, for your presentation. I'm excited to our debate later on. And I saw that some participants raised their hands, but if you want to leave your question in the Q&A, and then we'll have time to talk about it later. So I'm speaking for the Center for Learning on Evaluation and Results for Lusophone Africa in Brazil. I'm going to present a research that we have been doing about institutionalization of evaluation at the subnational level in Brazil. I'm very happy to be here today. It is one of the first times we talk about this research, and especially internationally. We haven't been able to share. We are writing the reports and finalizing the report. And I see here for the participants that we have some participants that are respondents to the survey and that attended our courses as well. So I'm really happy to see them here. We have people from states and municipalities in Brazil that have been partners of us during this process of the diagnostic. And thank you everyone else for coming, of course. So just to give a brief overview of CLEAR Lab, we were created in 2015. There was a competitive process to select the CLEAR regional centers that are located across the Global South, and there are 6 of them, and we were the ones selected, and we are hosted at the São Paulo School of Economics of Fundação Getulio Vargas in São Paulo, Brazil. We conduct activities related to monitoring and evaluation, so activities of research, capacity building, technical assistance, and knowledge dissemination. This is our operational map. As we mentioned before, we act in Brazil and also in the African countries that speak Portuguese, which are Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, and Angola. And the research that I'm going to present to you, as it was mentioned before, it is about Brazil, but it is a wish of us at CLEAR Lab to at some point be able also to do some research of this type in the African countries that we work on. Just also to give an overview of Brazil, as Aya was mentioning about South Africa and Benin, all the countries vary in the structure of the levels of government. So in Brazil, we have 3 levels of government: the federal government, 26 states, and the federal district, and the municipalities, which we have over 5,500 municipalities. We are organized as a federal country, and we are a democracy. So our subnational level, it refers to states and municipalities, and that is the object of our diagnostic. Meaning, the fact that we are a federal country means, in our case, that states and municipalities, they have autonomy. So they have their own government structure, they have their own laws, they have their own local administration, and that started for the municipalities in the Constitution of 1988. And this is different from, let's say, the United States, where the municipalities, they have powers if states give them powers. But in Brazil, from our Constitution, municipalities have powers to govern themselves and to create their own laws and organic laws, which are kind of the constitutions of municipalities. And the federal district is not a state per se, but it has the same status as a state and a special status as the seat of the federal government, and that's where Brasilia is. Aya talked about their definition of institutionalization. Let me share what we have been working with in terms of this concept. So we understand that institutionalization refers to making evaluation practices integral to the normal functioning of the government. That means making evaluation part of the routine of the public administration, as in the same way that administrations do planning, budgeting, that they design and implement public policies, that they would also conduct evaluation practices related to their programs and policies. Another definition that we use is understanding institutionalization as the process by which evaluation systems are created or modified. And he mentions here abolished, but this is not necessarily the horizon we are looking at today in Brazil. We have been seeing that evaluation systems have been created, and some of them have already undergone modifications, as it is the case for the system of the federal government. The idea here to connect evaluation and systems is that the system is a body of norms and structures and practices that is organized in a way to enable evaluation practices. And we are going to be talking about systems throughout this presentation. And I mentioned that South Africa and Benin are part of the first wave of institutionalization of evaluation in Africa. And for Brazil, it's different because Brazil joined it a bit late in comparison to other countries even in Latin America. We had Chile and Colombia and Mexico being earlier examples of institutionalizing evaluation. But Brazil had a surge of development in the 2010s. First, we have the federal government creating a monitoring and evaluation system. It was created in 2016 with the Council of Monitoring and Evaluation of Public Policies, which was in 2019 transformed in a committee, but it is a bit the same organization. And it was a very important step because in Brazil, although we are a federal country, meaning that we have autonomy among the entities, it is also true that the federal government serves as an inspiration for states and municipalities. And so having this structure in the federal government also served as a clue for local governments and regional governments to create their own system and how they could do it. And then we had in 2021 a constitutional amendment, which I'm going to show in the next slide. And since then, several states and some municipalities in Brazil created their own monitoring and evaluation systems. Here we have a photo of the launch of the M&E system of the city of Niterói 2 years ago. And this was the very first municipality that created an M&E system, and it was a very important achievement. I was mentioning that we had the constitutional amendment, and as you may know, Brazil is a civil law country, and in that sense, having a constitutional amendment is kind of a big deal for us because it means that we have to go through a very specific process in the Congress and have to approve. And it means that there was a lot of political engagement and political support to have this text in the Constitution. And what we have now is that we have an obligation of the public administration to carry out policy evaluation. So as you can read here, it says, public administration bodies and entities, individually or jointly, must carry out the evaluation of public policies, including publicizing the object to be evaluated and the results achieved in accordance with the law. That means that public administration has to carry out evaluation and also has to publicize the results and the object of the evaluation, which is a very strong signal of Brazil's commitment to accountability and integrity and compliance. And so it comes within this agenda. And this specific law that the Constitution refers to has not been edited, which does not mean that states and municipalities cannot do evaluation. It only means that there is no further guidelines or rules regarding evaluation besides what is here, and it's another small paragraph of the Constitution and in the part related to the pluriannual plan. And as you can see here, it's also the fact that we have evaluation in our Constitution is not that common. It's only a few countries in the world that have evaluation in their Constitution. So Germany, we have here, France, Mexico, Colombia, and Costa Rica that Dirk also talked about earlier. Coming to our diagnostic, we seeing this surge of evaluation systems in Brazil and seeing that this topic was progressing, still we didn't have a clear picture of what all the states and the biggest cities in Brazil were doing. So we decided to do the diagnostic to achieve a comprehensive understanding of this degree of institutionalization and use of evaluation in decision-making in Brazil. We had a methodology, which I'm going to explain a bit later, and the result of our research is a diagnostic that analyzes the state of institutionalization in Brazilian governments at the 3 different levels, so state, municipal, and federal level. And we developed a classification in 4 different levels according to the elements of institutionalization. And this, we also discuss common challenges and opportunities, which I'm going to hopefully have the time to comment here with you today. In terms of methodology, we sent, similar to what Ayabulela described in their research, we sent a questionnaire to public agents. In our case, we sent to all states, so 26 plus federal district, and we sent it to the capital cities, which are also 26, and cities with over 500,000 inhabitants, which by chance are also 26. And we asked questions about norms, structures, practices, quality, and use of evaluation. Then we conducted semi-structured interviews with the same public agents that answered the questionnaire to collect some of their inputs about practices and eventual changes that happened. We have been noticing that because this topic is quite recent in Brazilian public administration, there have been several types of minor adjustments and progressive changes that have been made. I think in the willingness to perfect these systems, there has been room for experimentation and for learning with experience, which has been very interesting to see, but also a bit challenging in terms of research because we see different changes, small changes, even in structure or in norms or different practices coming up. And we have been trying to capture these elements. And of course, we conducted literature analysis and did a benchmarking of classifications of evaluation systems, of institutionalization across the world in different countries. So in our diagnostic, we studied 5 different elements, which we understand to be elements of evaluation systems or elements of institutionalization. And these elements are a bit the same that I just mentioned for the questionnaire. So we have a bit of the same structure. We have laws and norms. So we ask and we interrogate and we look for valid legal acts referring to evaluation. We look at institutional structures, meaning management and governance structures within the public administration. And importantly, we look at evaluation practices. So how often evaluations have been conducted, which types of evaluation, and what has been the procedures to ensure quality of evaluations. Then we look at capacity development as a means to foster evaluation within the public administration by making it more routinized and make it more standardized. So you have a training, everyone is learning the same way to talk and to do evaluations. You have guidebooks, handbooks, they give instructions as how to evaluate and what to look for. And then lastly, we looked at evaluation use, meaning after evaluations are done, how does the public administration appropriate the results of evaluations and how do they adopt or not the recommendations that were given in the evaluation studies. Then, departing from these 5 elements, we observed how all the respondents and the participants of the diagnostic answered to the different elements. And we developed a categorization into levels of institutionalization. As you can see here in the screen, we have some states and municipalities, but I'm happy to say that is the smallest group is the one that has few elements of evaluation. The thing about this group is that we could not really identify practices of evaluation, but we have observed that these states and municipalities have norms and have administrative structure related to evaluation. So there is an underlying framework that would enable them to do evaluations very soon if they wish so, or if they have the capacity to do so. And then we have the next level, which is the states that have some evaluation. Many Brazilian states and municipalities fall into this category because they have practice with evaluation, mostly evaluation of plans. In Brazil, it is the pluriannual plan. And they have not really done evaluation of policies in a systematic manner. And that would be the case for the next categories. So systems under development are the subnational governments that have created systems, but that are currently under implementation. And that may be so for a different amount of reasons. One reason is that maybe the system of evaluation is very recent. And we're very happy that just 2 weeks ago, both the state and the municipality of São Paulo created their evaluation systems, and they didn't have time. It was literally 2 weeks ago, so they didn't have time to start implementing it, but it is in the future, the very near future, for that to be seen. And we have some systems that were created, but maybe the political support changed, so they couldn't really implement the activities of evaluation. And then we have a group that is the group that has effective systems of evaluation. I'm going to talk about this group in the next slides, but basically here, what you should retain is that there are some states in Brazil and one municipality that have a system of monitoring and evaluation, and that in a planned manner, they conduct evaluation of policies, and they conduct rapid evaluation, impact evaluation, ex-ante evaluation, ex-post evaluation, different types of evaluation, and they have mechanisms to report and to publicize the results of evaluation. And sometimes they have mechanisms also to ensure that the public administration is using the results of the evaluation and is appropriating from the recommendations. Dirk, can you give me an update on time? I forgot to time myself.
No, you're still doing fine. 5 more minutes.
Okay. Thank you. We have currently 9 evaluation systems created at the subnational level in Brazil. And bear in mind that this all happened since 2017. So we are seeing here that there was quite a fast progress. 7 systems are in states, 2 in municipalities. So I already mentioned the 2 municipalities. One is São Paulo, which just created the system 2 weeks ago. And the other one is Niterói, which created a system in 2022. And all of these systems, 5 have been implemented, and the other 4, as I was explaining, they have laws that have the structure, but the activities are under implementation. I'm going to, before I go to the final remarks, I'm just going to give example of 2 systems in Brazilian states. The first one is the state of Espírito Santo. It is the first evaluation system at the subnational level in Brazil. And since it was created in 2017, every year they have been doing cycles of evaluation. And so far they have conducted evaluation of 15 state programs. And all these evaluations contain recommendations, and that they are public in their website. One interesting characteristic of this system is that they invested quite a lot in handbooks of policy evaluation. So they published 4 handbooks of policy evaluation, and these handbooks, they are expected to create some routinization of practices and to create a common ground in which the policymakers can work and in which the evaluators can get trained and can operate. For the evaluation system of the state of Minas Gerais, it was created in 2021. Every year they publish an evaluation plan, and this evaluation plan contains usually 9 or 10 state policies that are going to be evaluated, and they discriminate which type of evaluation is going to be done. So is it a results evaluation, diagnostic, RAPT evaluation, impact evaluation? Who is going to be doing it? And they can distribute responsibilities. It can be the Secretary of Planning, or they can be a research institute associated to the government. So they have a quite interesting arrangement of dividing the responsibilities and making sure there are different perspectives integrated into the making of evaluations. And they also have sector-specific offices. So let's say in the Secretary of Planning or in the Secretary of Health, they would have people there that would support with data collection, but would also receive training and serve as multipliers of knowledge. And they also publish everything online in their website. You can search for this online for the annual plan or the reports also that they publish every year. So just to finalize this part, as I mentioned before, there has been quite a lot of progress considering that Brazil joined this wave of institutionalization of evaluation quite recently in the 2016, 2015. And evaluation was included in the Constitution in 2019. So since then, we have seen that 7 states created their evaluation systems. 2 municipalities also created evaluation systems, which is for us, as we discussed it when I talked about the concept of institutionalization. If we have a system, it is a strong indication of institutionalization. For us, it is the highest level of institutionalization. And we also see that from our research that within public administration, there is a consensus that evidence-based policy is important, that accountability is a shared value, that public service delivery has to improve, and that evaluation can contribute to that. And we also saw by talking to public agents that there is quite a lot of demand for evaluation within governments. So we collected answers from some states that they say, if we had a bigger team, we could be doing so many more evaluations because the local policymaking offices, they ask us for evaluations and they want this contribution, be it in the design of evaluations or to assess the results. And this has shown that this is showing to us that there is an ecosystem that can support a stronger offer of evaluation if the demand is there. And then something we can maybe comment later is the challenges of varying levels of technical capacity, financial resources, and political support, which we know from the literature and from practice that are very important elements to support the strengthening of evaluation. And in some Brazilian states, as Dirk was mentioning how big Brazil is, but it's also quite unequal. So we have cities that are quite rich and states that are quite poor. And so that difference also reflects in the institutionalization in this strengthening, because also in Brazil, we don't have, I would say, as Aya mentioned, in some African countries, that we have a lot of donor-led evaluation, that in Brazil, we see that this comes from the governments themselves and sometimes from financial agreements with international organizations, but for the most part, it is an internal demand. And so the financial resources, they would have a strong impact in that. But we can talk about this later. I hope it was clear. If not, we have time to discuss together. And here are also the references that I used in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorena. Thank you for this exciting presentation. I think we have a great overview now of what is happening in Brazil, what has been happening recently. Actually, I was not aware that Brazil and Latin America was one of the later countries to come in, having a federal structure. But it's also interesting to see that when you discuss evaluation monitoring in Latin America, sometimes you forget about Brazil because of the language and because it seems like such a big country that you can't easily include in a group, so you stick with the Spanish-speaking world. Maybe that's happening to some of you as well, or maybe that's happening vice versa. I don't know. Lots of things to comment on. I will limit myself to very few things. Both studies, from what I can see, used a very similar methodology. There's differences, of course, but it is very much, very much alike. We've touched on the concept of institutionalization, and interestingly, for Twende Mbele, institutionalization includes the use of evaluation. And Lorena, you made the case that what we need is institutionalization and use. You mentioned the two things. For one of you, it's inside, it's outside. Maybe this is not a big thing to discuss, but that's something that stood out. One other thing, we've been talking about it briefly in the introduction. It is very important to reflect on the political system. How centralized, how decentralized is a country, the devolution of power to subnational levels. And that is really something that is always important to keep in mind when you try to compare across countries, across continents, that there is a specific context, which leads me to think further, what does all this mean? What would all this mean in terms of discussing levels of democracy? Democratic governments, or more open democratic, more liberal societies, better places for subnational evaluation systems. Would a more authoritarian regime provide more space, more opportunity for subnational M&E systems? All things that come to my mind we might be discussing. For the first round, I would like to ask a different question, however, and that goes to each of you. And I'll ask you primero, first, Ayabulela. From what you've just heard about Brazil, from the presentation, from the research that Lorena presented, what is the most striking feature? What is the most surprising element? What is one thing that, from your perspective in Africa, stands out? Don't mention everything that she said and 1, 2, 3, 5, but just maybe pick on one element that you found new, surprising, important, or worrying, or whatever. Please.
All right. No, thanks so much, Dirk. I think for me, the most striking feature, which is a common thread in Lorena's presentation, and I guess the study in Brazil, is that so Brazil has sort of done it differently to how Sub-Saharan Africa established its evaluation systems. And the most important feature I see in the Brazilian case is the constitutional amendment. And from that constitutional amendment requiring public policy evaluation, I think that the states then took it upon themselves to also create their own laws, probably to comply with that federal kind of law. And that becomes then the basis for these states and some of the municipalities to establish M&E systems. Whereas I think in our context, most of the evaluation systems started with the policies. Now, I think the strength, and I can see why now there's such a mushrooming of M&E systems across the states in Brazil, because a policy is not as mandatory, or it's not as enforceable as a law. So a law tends to sort of encourage some sort of degree of compliance. And that is why I think Brazil is sort of becoming probably a success story for the mushrooming of evaluation systems across the states, because that constitutional amendment, I don't know, I don't want to put in strong language, but it has sort of strongly encouraged the other states to sort of leap into this, I would call it a fever of establishing public policy evaluation. So it's really a great thing, because in our side, it started with policies, whereas Brazil has gone the other way, because we only have 2 laws on M&E, and it's not even a constitutional amendment, but a law. That is Benin, Cote d'Ivoire. Ghana has some mentioning of monitoring and evaluation in the constitution, but I guess it's up for interpretation as with any law. So kudos to Brazil. Great stuff.
Thank you very much for that comment, for that reflection. Not surprisingly, Lorena, my question to you, what is the most striking element, the most remarkable thing you learned about what's happening in Africa, in Benin or in South Africa? Please.
Thank you, Dirk. Yes, I think when I first saw the research, and today I think it confirmed, it was very interesting to me to see the emphasis on the link between planning and budgeting, because for us in Brazil, we do have a link with our planning instrument. So we have a major multi-annual plan, and there is a link between evaluation and that plan for sure. But then for the budgetary aspects is a conversation that we are just starting. Actually, we just had a panel of GLOCO yesterday about spending review in Brazil and how to bring it to Brazil. And we know that the federal government has started to look at this issue. But I think even from the methodology and from the way that they asked questions and how they went to look for this link, because I see that it reflects in a kind of value statement, as well as Aya said about social change and bringing food to the table. So maybe this link between we really need to make good use of money to ensure that people have better quality of life. And that emphasis was very interesting to me.
Thank you very much. While we're talking, a reminder to the audience, please put your questions, comments to the Q&A. We haven't received a single question or comment. We don't have the possibility to open the microphone for the audience for technical reasons and to avoid interference of unwanted content. So please think of your questions, or if you have questions already, just put them to the Q&A. Comments are always welcome. Having said that, one other thing that listening to the two of you, the examples from Francophone Africa, Benin, from Anglophone Africa, South Africa, from Lusophone country, Brazil and Latin America, there was very little mention of learning. We see that a number of evaluation systems, the monitoring evaluation systems, M&E systems commonly, they move into MEL systems, being monitoring, evaluation, learning systems. I remember last year, the Tanzanian Evaluation Week was actually a Tanzanian week for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And for DEval, we also see always evaluation as having different functions, like accountability, obviously, you have transparency, but while doing ECD work, evaluation capacity development work, we always think that learning is an important aspect. You touched upon ECD, on evaluation capacity development, but maybe you can, each of you, reflect a bit further on where learning comes in, specifically when we talk about subnational level. Who writes guides for subnational level? Subnational level itself, we heard from South Africa, network of metropolitan municipalities. Who writes the guidelines? Who makes up the rules on subnational level? Is it central government for all the subnational level? Is it autonomous municipalities in reinventing the wheel in 100 different places? And how does that connect to learning? I'd be very happy to have your reflections first, Ayabulela, and then towards Lorena, please.
All right. No, thanks, Chair, for I think it's two questions, if I interpreted you correctly. I think on the first question of learning from monitoring, learning from evaluations, I think it speaks to, well, I think you were mentioning the gap or the shortage, or maybe we didn't have emphasis on that. I think it speaks to the gap between producers of monitoring, because if we were to look at monitoring and evaluation systems and governance as sort of economies, people in economics will always tell you about supply and demand. So I think after the 2000s, 2010s and 2020s, I think the capacity to produce most of these reports or evidence, we do have a sufficient level. The problem now, I think, where we need to graduate and start intervening more and maybe focus on in terms of evaluation capacity development, it's on the demand side. And here, the demand side, I think it will be improved once we start making inroads into bringing in decision makers into capacity building, into peer learning forums, into conferences, into validation workshops for evaluations where we actually sit and discuss the results of an evaluation, such that by the time that decision maker or a minister or a secretary for, let's say, planning and development goes back to their desk to make a decision or goes to cabinet, they already know what that evaluation is saying and the importance of that evaluation or those recommendations in terms of policy X, Y, and Z. So I think for us on the sub-Saharan African region, much work needs to be done in terms of building the appreciation for evaluation results amongst policymakers, because essentially those are the people who want to sort of take up evidence. So I think the reason why the learning probably, Dirk, is not at the level where we would want it to be, it's probably because I think we still need to bridge that demand side gap. The second thing I want to mention, Dirk, which we did have a discussion before, it's the cultures of public administration, because I think I do agree with you when you opened in your initial remarks after the presentations that we can't think of monitoring and evaluation outside of political systems, because it is the political systems that give rise to everything in terms of governance. And M&E is not separate from governance. I think it's part and parcel because it's a governance function or a management or public management function. So you've got various public administration cultures mushrooming or that are established. Public administration in terms of maybe a public administration of competition, public administration of compliance, and so on. Now, if we were to take that one of public administration culture of compliance, probably you'll find Ayabulela being a monitoring and evaluation officer who is doing monitoring to tick a box that I have produced this report, and therefore I am satisfied. What happens to that report, I have done my part. This is the end of the road. So I think the various shifts in cultures, which is happening, I think, because one of the importance of monitoring and evaluation is that it is supposed to influence public administration culture. And that's a work in progress. So that's on the first question. The second one on who writes guidelines for subnational government. So I think the prevalent phenomenon in sub-Saharan Africa is that national government still produces the guidelines, and the expectation is that subnational governments, be it provincial governments or regional governments or counties or municipalities, they are supposed to use those. And I guess you are asking that question to probably ring fence a problem. So let me not go into it because you might be probing into it. So let me hand over to Lorena.
Thank you very much, Ayabulela. Lorena, please.
Yes, I think learning from thinking in terms of Brazil, it's an interesting question because what we have observed so far, and I'm trying not to put too much our organization into it because that's one of our missions actually to foster learning on monitoring and evaluation, and we often act as a bridge between states and municipalities that want to learn about evaluation and ours and others that already have this expertise. So, and we ourselves teach and train about monitoring and evaluation. But I would say in terms of public administration, it is a bit each one on their own, I feel at this moment. I don't know if that's the trend that is going to continue, but we do have a guide, a handbook that the federal government issued, but that's a more methodological and theoretical guide, and it's not really instructions for how to do monitoring and evaluation systems. And I think that's why the states that have been institutionalizing, they have developed their own handbooks and developed their own training. And even if you think in terms of the federal government, they have a school of government, but that's mainly for federal public agents. And some states in Brazil also have schools of government. Let's say the state of Minas Gerais has Fundação João Pinheiro, which is a school of government, and they lead a lot of those processes related to learning, and they also make connection with university, being themselves also a higher education institution. So it kind of depends on the arrangement. We've seen that a lot of the states that have been investing in that, they have sought partnerships with universities. So the state of Ceará is an example of a strong partnership with the university, just to not to make this answer too long, but just to mention, because they have a program that is quite incredible about, it's called head scientists, that they hire people from academia to work in the government. And in the case of evaluation, a lot of these people are doing evaluations, and economists with PhD, they're doing evaluation of policies in Ceará. And so we see that, and we see also in Espírito Santo, which I mentioned, they also have connection with the Public Research Foundation, and Minas Gerais as well, as I mentioned, with the case of the School of Government. So it would be, if I can give a general answer, each on its own, but hopefully with the help of academia, and that's a bit of how they have been doing it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting you bring in academia and the role of universities. It has been briefly mentioned, but I think this is one of the topics, if we had another webinar, that we might be exploring in much more depth. You mentioned university academia being important in evaluation. We've seen other cases, other places where it's actually universities that have courses that do evaluation capacity development for government sectors or in combination with government agencies. But that's also a topic that could be explored in much more depth. Let me leave the panel for now and move to the audience. We promised we'd open up the discussion to the audience, and we do have two first questions. I'm very happy about those, so please think about more. We still have a bit of time. There's one from Gus that I will be reading. Thank you both for the excellent presentations. My question is for Lorena. Do we know how much, if any, knowledge dissemination, sharing, and support there is between the more established sublocal entities, like Espírito Santo, and the ones at earlier stages of planning and implementation? Yeah, question goes to you, Lorena.
Thank you. That's a great question. We haven't seen this in a systematic manner, except for, as I mentioned, the role of CLEAR Lab in promoting these connections. But every time we are invited to give mentorship to a state, we always bring someone from a state that has a system to give a presentation to talk about their experience. So in that sense, we do a bit of this work of being a network of entities and bringing states closer together. But that's definitely something that hopefully we can see in the future in Brazil, because we've seen that in other topics, let's say climate change, that states and municipalities, they have been partnering, and how much that helps. And so maybe for something for M&E would also be very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from Lycia Lima, and it goes to both panelists. In each of your contexts, do you think there are common challenges in all countries or all states? And if so, what do you think is the main challenge for institutionalization of M&E? And again, keeping the order we had established before, first go to Ayabulela and then after that to you, Lorena.
Okay, no, thanks, Madam Lycia, for that question. I think, so M&E is as much a practice as it is behavioral change. And often I think we mentioned public administration cultures, and I think what's important to appreciate about public administration culture is that it's something that is established essentially over a period of time. And so it takes time for you to sort of bring about changes. So what we're speaking about in terms of M&E institutionalization, I think it's a fundamental change, a paradigm shift from essentially doing governance in certain ways towards now moving towards what the paradigm is essentially evidence-based decision-making or evidence-based policy-making. And the other thing I want to mention, Dirk, about M&E institutionalization, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which at times in M&E, because I know in monitoring and evaluation, we tend to want to shy away from big topics. And for me, I think there's no topic that is big to speak about. In Africa, you've got a phenomenon of post-colonial states. I think we were mentioning this, Dirk. So government beyond the capital city or maybe the areas of economic activity in most African states is probably not as pronounced as maybe in a capital city or a city where there's great economic activity and so on and so forth. So naturally, you'll probably find that the more you move away from your established cities and so on, the level of governance you find there, or the presence of the state, first and foremost, not even governance, the presence of the state sort of withers away. So that speaks a lot then in terms of when the state is not present, how much more for governance, implementation of policies, you probably find that there's not so much about it. So if there's not a lot of policy implementation in far-flung areas, then there's no way you're going to have monitoring or evaluation. So I think that also affects, so things that affect M&E institutionalization, public administration culture, the presence of the state as well in most cities beyond the capital or economic areas where most people tend to sort of concentrate. So you'll find a lot of human concentration or population concentration in certain areas, and in others probably there's not so much of governance. And so on and so forth. So it's quite a lot of things, but I think what we're moving towards now in sub-Saharan Africa is grassroots monitoring and evaluation, bringing in public voices, because in the absence of sufficient governance or sufficient state presence, the good thing is that you've got a lot of citizens. So we're saying that essentially you'll have things such as frontline monitoring, for instance, in South Africa, where government is supposed to go to the people, people give feedback. Not necessarily that thing where in order for you to hear citizens' voices, you need to go and put out a survey when doing an evaluation. So even in monitoring now, we're moving to that thing of saying, bring in grassroots voices. So I think it's a work in progress, but I think it's progress in the right direction.
Thank you. Now to you, Lorena.
Thank you. No, I agree with what Aya said, and not to repeat. I think I can give a bit of a different set of challenges that in Brazil, I think mostly it's related to being able to prioritize public policies. We don't have a tradition of planning that is associated with establishing clear priorities. Our tradition of planning is getting everything that we do and put it in a 1,000 pages plan. And so when it comes to evaluation, how do you select what you're going to evaluate and what you're not going to evaluate? And how do you communicate within the government that that policy was selected among all others, and maybe that's not going to be well received, maybe it is, but it is a communication process within the government, and an effort to be clear about priorities. And I think coincidentally, the states that we have seen that have made some advancements, they are states that have some type of strategic plan or a program that they have clear targets, and they are able to select policies to evaluate from there. And I think so far, to not do this prioritization, we just do a kind of not so in-depth evaluation of a bit of everything. and I think this trend, it does not really support evaluation so much. I think it's good for monitoring, and we have seen monitoring being fostered in public administration when they have panels online that people can access and look at progress and indicators, etc. But the evaluation part is less present. And of course, within that, it's not only prioritization, but probably mostly the fact that we still are training evaluators within the government, and even training people to see that this is an activity that they can do and what does it entail. And for sure, I would say that in most local governments, there is very limited technical capacity for evaluation, and even to people who are not doing evaluation to be able to understand what is evaluation and what is the other people going to be doing with your policy. And so this is still something. So I would say, and for that, of course, you need resources, you need political support, and those two would never go out of the equation. But to go a bit outside the obvious, I would say capacity and being able to be clear about government priorities.
Okay, thank you very much. While we've been talking, we have a few more questions coming up. I will read one from Marilia Firmiano, and that goes to both of you. To promote institutionalization in subnational governments, where to start? You start with training, advocacy, or both? What are the best strategies? Ayabulela, again, I'd like you to go first.
Okay, no, thanks, Dirk. I think I'll relay a message that was given to us by a subnational minister. I think in Brazil it's the equivalent of a Secretary of State, but at a subnational regional level. So we were having a conference, and the minister at that particular conference said, we often hear a lot about monitoring and evaluation and so on. And he mentioned that the government was essentially considering policies for the next 5 years. He said not even one evaluation was in that meeting amongst cabinet. Even beyond cabinet, even in the governing party itself, whenever they are considering policies, they never saw any evaluation to inform those policy discussions in terms of where we are going, which speaks to what I think Lorena was saying about prioritization. There was no evaluation. So I think certainly when as we move towards subnational M&E institutionalization, we need to factor in that probably let's not repeat the mistakes we've made at national or maybe federal levels. Let's now start to say, if we're intervening in terms of evaluation capacity development, let's supplement it with advocacy for M&E use amongst politicians, because at the end of the day, it's politicians who make policies. And it's politicians also who decide to scale up a policy or even terminate it. So let's include a certain level. And I think in the African continent, one country that used to be leading in this area was, I think, Kenya. Because in Kenya, they used to have what they call monitoring evaluation weeks. Dirk, something you mentioned about Tanzania. What was good about that was that that event was not essentially attended by M&E practitioners. So you would have ministers coming in or county governors coming in, presenting an annual report or even listening into annual reports. So by the time they move out of that monitoring and evaluation conference, they know what their government has achieved or their public institution has achieved over a 1-year period. And from there, they probably know where they need to amplify and strengthen in terms of public policies and so on, both at the county level as well as at the national level. So I think more discourse around M&E needs to now factor in the political face of M&E, because we always speak about lack of political will, but political will is not something that will just happen overnight, and it's not some magic that will come through. Political will needs a lot of advocacy. So I think we need to start playing into that space, because at the end of the day, we'll start producing more and more reports. It's good to have sufficient capacity to do evaluations and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we need that appreciation from the demand side so that that M&E institutionalization goes hand in hand, and there's no gaps in between. So I think, Chair, let me stop there.
Thank you very much. We'll pass over the microphone to you, Lorena.
Thank you. I will be brief on this one because I agree 100% with Ayabulela, and he put it very well. And also it's a bit of related to our role as CLEAR Lab, that we have this mixture of training and dissemination of knowledge and advocacy. So it's a bit of the way that we see our mission. But I think I see that we have other questions coming up, but yes, let's continue.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we have about 5 more minutes, or maybe 6, and have 2 more questions here. One from Merci Fanazzo. Thank you for both your presentations. And this one goes to Ayabulela. To what extent has Twende Mbele been successful facilitating the adoption of recommendations in the countries you work with, apart from South Africa, like sharing any success stories?
No, thanks so much, Dirk. So I think Twende Mbele's success, I would say first and foremost, it's found in the fact that I'll give the most recent example. So in Niger, they have what we call a free maternal and child healthcare policy for pregnant women aged 0 to 5 years. I think this was a policy that emanated from the Millennium Development Goals era around 2006, responding to issues of child mortality and so on, maternal mortality and so on. So because I mean, one of the issues we have in terms of institutionalization, again, of M&E, is the lack of funding. But I think over time, Twende Mbele recognized that, okay, since traditional evaluations are more expensive, there's an innovation coming through with rapid methodologies. So Twende Mbele adopted rapid evaluation support to all these countries as a standing permanent function, I think since 2021. And truth be told, I think that has been a success story, because since 2021, I think over 7 rapid evaluations have been done across the countries. Actually, I think it's 8 since 2021. And for that Niger example, that rapid evaluation was actually commissioned at a time when public health institutions were complaining that that policy is not sustainable. Government had committed to sort of put funding so that when a public institution admits, because naturally there was a lot of demand for that, if you know the history of our continent in terms of burden of disease, child mortality, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of demand on public health institutions and so on. So one of the policy questions the government was sitting in Niger was that, do we continue with this policy? Is there demand? Is there sufficient uptake? Are public health institutions financially ready or financially able to respond to the demands for maternal health care, child health care, and so on? So I think that rapid evaluation helped answer some of the policy questions. And a major one came through in terms of the sustainability of public health institutions in the face of that massive demand. The other one was an unintended consequence, actually, that was told by the government of Niger when we were speaking with them post the rapid evaluation, to say, hey, one of the things we found is that population growth has been a major factor, because now that we no longer have maternal mortality and so on, naturally the population is growing. And so those are the unintended consequences. So I think to answer that question, Twende Mbele usually intervenes both in terms of commissioning as well as uptake. And one of the mechanisms we have is summits such as this, learning summits or roundtables, where we say, okay, 2 years ago, you commissioned a rapid evaluation. Come and tell us what has happened since then. Some of the innovation, because Twende Mbele is sort of like a peer-to-peer learning kind of institution where countries learn from each other. And South Africa pioneered one thing, and I mentioned South Africa because that thing has sort of been exported. I think it was a management response, which is essentially an institution that was evaluating, saying, okay, out of these recommendations, we accept recommendation 1, 2, and 3. Then from that management response, you move into an improvement action plan. So those are 2 things that make sure that you are able to sort of action recommendations. And that model of management responses and improvement action plans post-evaluation has been adopted by countries such as Benin and countries such as Uganda. And with the expansion of Twende Mbele to include 3 other countries, we have sort of also impressioned that same practice of sort of advocating now for the use of recommendations using management responses and improvement action plans across our countries. So I think that is 1 or 2 successes I can share, Dirk, over.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is very important, to let others know what happened, what are the good results, best practices, not to be copied, but to help think what can you do in your own context. We have one more question before I would then go to a final round with the two of you. This question again goes to Ayabulela. It comes from Lucia Bueno. Thank you for the presentation. Please, in the African context, what is the level of coordination from the African Union and regional organizations in the capacity building for statistics and indicators production? This goes a bit beyond the scope of what we've been discussing. I leave it up to you whether you think you would like to comment, or we pass that on to someone that is more inclined, because we've been talking about capacity buildings, local level, subnational level, but please feel free to comment or to be brief, whatever.
Yeah, I think, Dirk, that is somewhat beyond our scope, but I'm sure having scoped NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development, one of their core functions is on the statistical function, and that's why actually statistical capacities in Africa far outgrow capacities for monitoring and evaluation. But that's just in passing. But as for, in terms of, I think, let me just pass that by, but just to say there are institutions in that kind of niche.
Okay, thank you very much. Then there's no more new questions. I would like to pick up on one comment that was put by Rafael Silva that has a question attached to it. And the question is also a little bit beyond what we've been discussing, strictly speaking, but might also deserve being mentioned. So I'd like to put it to you, and please feel free to take it up in more detail or not, as you deem appropriate. Can the digital transformation help to consolidate monitoring and evaluation cultures? I mean, this is a big one. This is probably one we could have a distinct webinar based on evidence of a diagnostic study or diagnostic research on that topic. So maybe I invite you each for a final statement, final consideration, and feel free to pick up on the digital one, or we leave that for the future, because I'm sure the digital revolution, artificial intelligence, is making inroads in evaluation. We've not incorporated it completely. It's still a work in progress, but it might be too much for us to consider at the moment, especially looking at the great diagnostic research that you presented. So you're open to comment, and as you've been hearing now twice from you, Ayabulela, answering questions that were directed directly to you, this time I'd like to start with Lorena to give her the opportunity to have a final comment, final takeaway for our audience.
Thank you, Dirk. As for final comment, I would just highlight that even though we have differences in the way we describe subnational, we have differences in our political and economic histories, I feel like there is a lot to learn from other experiences in subnational evaluation, and I'm really happy to be able to hear from the experience of Sub-Saharan Africa. And I hope that is some type of dialogue that we can continue to have. And in terms of the digital revolution, as I said in the chat, and as you said, it's a big question, but I would say that we see already in Brazil that there have been more panels of data, monitoring data, and we have been also seeing this trend of being more transparent and more accountable in what comes to publicizing the results of public policies and publicizing reports. And at least I feel that if people can start following policy data online, and if they can be familiar with indicators and this type of language, and it's already helping to foster this culture of M&E. And from the side of evaluators, of course, it helps because you have more information readily available. And even it is surprising to see that even sometimes within government, the access to data is not granted. So even government making data available that other people in the government can see is already a big advancement, actually. So just that would be it. And thank you for your questions and for moderating.
Thank you very much. Now over to you, Ayabulela, final reflections.
No, thanks, Dirk. First one on digitalization and how great it is in terms of access to evidence, timely evidence. Just two examples to share from the Twende Mbele countries. In Ghana, they have what we call a performance tracker. It's a digital performance tracker based on government's priority programs over a 4-year period, because that's how Ghana has a 4-year term, government has a 4-year term. So they've established a performance tracker that is residing in the office of the president, tracking essentially priority programs with outcome and output and outcome indicators, which is good, because often at times most of these M&E systems tend to be towards the side of outputs, but Ghana has sort of managed to try and attempt to move towards outcome indicator tracking and so on. So that's on the Ghana side. But of course, this is a digital system that is a work in progress, because it was just launched in March 2024, actually after the Africa Evaluation Association. So hopefully that digital tracker of results continues. And then Uganda also has a similar one based on its National Development Plan 3. But again, it's also a work in progress. The trick with these digital systems, it goes with government mechanisms as well, is that if Dirk is in government, of course, he'll have access to it. So it's not readily accessible to the general public. So it's more like an intranet kind of thing for government. So I think digitalization, there is a wave of digitalization in terms of M&E on the continent, but again, a work in progress. But I think we are moving towards an orange indicator that is looking upwards, then downwards. So I think, yeah, long may that continue. And then in terms of closing remarks, I want to thank Dirk, yourself, for the excellent moderation, your expert facilitation of dialogue. It's something that is underrated, certainly in spaces of sharing and learning. And thank you again to CLEAR, Lusophone Africa in Brazil, for inviting Twende Mbele to this audience, because essentially, I think if we didn't have an audience of 24 people, it means we're speaking to ourselves. So I think the value of these engagements is that there are people who engage with the presentations as the audience has done. Thank you very much for all the questions, and yeah, long may it continue.
Thank you very much, Ayabulela, and let me continue with a thanking. Thanks to the audience, obviously, for all of us that have been here with us. Thank you especially to those that posed some questions that made up for the debate. That are really important to have. Thank you to the interpreters, also from my side, and thanks to CLEAR Lab for having me, for the confidence, and it was really a privilege to be chairing the session. There's a lot of questions I still have. There's a lot to discuss, and yeah, as Lorena said, it would be good to have some sort of follow-up. At least let's meet in a year in this place at the next GLocal and see what we can advance. Maybe that is an idea. And for the final words, I hand over to Lycia Lima. So goodbye and thank you from my side.
Thank you so much, Dirk, for a wonderful moderation of this great panel. Thanks to our speakers, Aya and Lorena. It was indeed great. I just wanted to wrap it up and say thank you to all of you who remained with us throughout this time. One thing I thought, Aya, that was very interesting on your comments is when you said M&E is about behavior change, like institutionalizing M&E, and I couldn't agree more. Like, it has to do with behavior change. It has to do with, like, challenging institutional reforms. So it's a challenging process. And I'd like to also agree with Lorena that there are often many similarities and many common challenges. So when you presented on Benin's recommendation, I realized that a lot of the stuff that we do, we have similar recommendations. And like Lorena said, contexts are very different and political systems and all of that, but actually we can learn a lot from each other. So I think this global knowledge exchange is very powerful, and there are a lot of benefits that can come up from keeping this conversation going. So I agree with Dirk, let's keep the conversation going. Thank you all for joining us. I would like you to stay tuned for our CLEAR and GEI throughout the year. I mean, we always hold events, CLEAR in all the regions, and GEI also holds many events on monitoring evaluation. And don't forget that today's day 2 of GLOCO. We have 350 events throughout this week. So check it out. There's many interesting topics being discussed. Thank you very much. Thank you for a great presentation, the panelists. Thank you, Dirk, for the moderation. And hopefully I'll see you in another events throughout the week.